This is the first mini lecture in inclusive education. What these mini lectures are trying to do are just teach core concepts in a quick short video. So this video is going to go over an introduction to inclusion and inclusive philosophy. So in this video and in this course, one of the things that we need to understand is that inclusion is not just something that teachers do. Inclusion is a philosophy and is a way of thinking in the classroom. It's also more than disability. So inclusion is about a variety of different things. So to start with, as an example, inclusion is about racial diversity. So certain students from certain countries and certain ethnicities will experience various barriers to their learning, such as racism and discrimination. Students that come from another country will also face barriers such as having English as a second language. So inclusion is about helping those students who speak another language, and it's also helping those students who might experience bullying or discrimination because they come from a different culture. Inclusion also looks at difference when it comes to sexuality. More recent research has shown us that a lot of students who identify as gay, lesbian, or intersex experience a lot of bullying at school and are getting lower grades than students that do not identify as LGBT. And so part of inclusion is also making sure that these students' well-being are being looked after. Inclusion also includes religious diversity. There are different students from different religious traditions that may experience discrimination or bullying or disadvantage because of their religious belief. In particular, there might be certain things in a school that students might not be allowed to do or that their families don't want them to do because of their religion. So inclusion is also being aware of those religious commitments that students have and making sure that that does not become a barrier to accessing a quality education. Inclusion is also about geography. In Australia, there are significant differences on achievement depending on where you live. Students who live in rural areas and in areas that are more isolated have certain disadvantages, such as less access to the internet, just as an example. So that is something that we also need to think about when we're thinking inclusion. Inclusion is also about the home environment. Different styles of parenting can have a significant impact on the way that students achieve. If they have authoritarian parents compared to if they have permissive parents. And one of the things that we want to try to do is to make sure that our parenting style, as much as possible, does not get in the way of a child's learning. And so that we are able to see those sorts of things that happen in different homes. And then finally, inclusion is also about money and economic stability. There's a lot of research that shows that children that come from poorer homes score lower in maths and numeracy and literacy. They have less opportunities for going to university beyond school, and they get less help at home. So inclusion is about a variety of different reasons that students might experience discrimination or barriers that stop them from learning. Of course, one of the biggest ones that we talk about in this course is disability. So when it comes to disability, we're talking about how different physical, social, intellectual problems can stop a child from learning. And when it comes to inclusion, there are basically 4 different ways that we can deal with people that have various barriers that might separate them from other students. So to start with, the first way is exclusion. So exclusion occurs when students are directly or indirectly prevented from or denied access to education in any form. So exclusion is when a child that has an intellectual disability is expelled from a school. Exclusion can also happen when a child tries to enter a school. So for more commonly, a child that has behavioural problems, they might get excluded from a school by being expelled. But a child with intellectual difficulties, sometimes a school might say when they're enrolling students, can we see your NAPLAN results? They look at the child's NAPLAN results and then the principal will say, sorry, we can't cater to the needs of your child because their scores are too low. And that is also exclusion. That is a practice called gatekeeping, where people are kept out of the school by various different means. The second method of educating students in Australia is segregation. So segregation occurs when the education of students with disability is provided in separate environments. So that's where you have a special needs school, or you have a boys' school and a girls' school, or you might have a selective school, or you might have a sports school. So those are types of segregation where specific cohorts of students are in a separate setting. One of the problems with segregation is that there's a lot of research that students who are taught in a separate special needs school have a lot of disadvantages. They tend to have lower literacy rates and lower numeracy rates, and they also tend to have less options for getting into university. But the advantage of a segregated setting is that they can get more attention and they can get more one-on-one support. So it's a bit controversial whether segregation, what to do when it comes into terms of segregation. In isolation from students without disabilities is the main focus here. So the next type of schooling is integration. So integration is a process of placing persons with disabilities in existing mainstream educational institutions as long as the former can adjust to the standard requirements. So there's a big difference between integration and inclusion. Just because a child is in a mainstream school, in a mainstream classroom, does not mean that they are included. You can be in a mainstream classroom and still get bullied. You can be in a mainstream classroom and not get your needs met. You can be in a mainstream classroom and the teacher doesn't change the curriculum to help you. So integration is when the children with disability are in the mainstream class, but they have to develop the skills to survive. And they have to adapt to the mainstream class. And this is not best practice. What we want to focus on is this concept of inclusion. So inclusion involves a process of systematic reform embodying changes and modifications in content. So inclusion is about changing the way we teach so that students with disabilities, students from different ethnicities, students that are LGBT, students that are poor, students that come from different parts of the country can all be involved in learning and get a high quality education. So inclusion is about changing the way you teach so that all students can learn. So in inclusion, there are a lot of different strategies that we use that we try to use to overcome barriers. And we do that to provide all students with a relevant range of equitable and participatory learning experience and environment that best corresponds to their requirements. So when we talk about best corresponding to their requirements, This is where things can get a little tricky with inclusion, integration, and segregation. Because when it comes to inclusion, sometimes you can't do everything. Sometimes you don't have the resources or the time to get to every single student that has an additional need. So what we try to do in inclusion is we try to use a system called the least restrictive environment. And I'm just going to talk about that really briefly. So the least restrictive environment is a concept about trying to educate students in a classroom that most appropriately meets their needs. From the research, we know that the best thing for students with disabilities in particular is to be in a normal classroom. We know that when students are in a normal classroom, they get better social skills, they do better on literacy, they do better on numeracy. We know that they're more likely to get a job when they leave school, and we know that they're more likely to go to TAFE or university. So regular classrooms are the best scenario. And this is where a student is fully mainstreamed into a regular classroom instruction. However, for some students, that is not possible because they might have significant behaviours that puts other people at risk, or they might need intensive instruction because they're quite a ways behind the rest of the class. You might be teaching a Year 9 class and have a student that's still reading at a Year 2 level. And that is not ideal. That is very hard to teach to. So the next best thing is regular classroom with consultation. That's when a student is taught by a regular classroom teacher who is advised by a special educator. So in the event where things are getting too hard, the next best thing is to have a specialist who advises the teacher and gives you tips and tricks to help include students with disabilities. Then the next best thing after that is a regular classroom with supplementary instruction. So that's when you're a normal teacher in a normal classroom, but for 1 or 2 periods a day, your child with a disability will be pulled out of class to get extra instruction. Now, technically, that is a form of segregation because the child is being taken away from the classroom. But it can be really restrictive for a child to be in a mainstream classroom and not get any of that extra help. So we have to think about what is the least restrictive. So for some students with severe, more complex learning needs, it is less restrictive to have a teacher to pull them out of class and give them one-on-one help. Another source is resource room. So that's when similar, but the teacher does it with a small group. So it pulls out a small group of children. Another is separate classroom. So that's where students attend a regular school, but they are in a special needs class. So once again, for some students that need more support, being in a separate classroom can be more inclusive because they get less bullying and they get more instruction that is tailored to their needs. But they can still interact with mainstream students at recess and lunch. Or they might be 50-50. They might be half in a special needs class and then half in a mainstream class. Sometimes schools will pull students into a special class just for English and math and then be in a regular class for everything else. Then the next least restrictive is separate school. I work in a special needs school for children with emotional and behavioural disabilities. There are some students who get so anxious about being bullied and so anxious about the workload in a mainstream school that they stop going to school. And in that situation, getting them to come to school is the most inclusive thing. If you can get them some sort of education, that is the least restrictive environment. And then after that is residential school. So that's students live in a 24-hour care facility. So this is more students who are non-verbal. Perhaps they can't walk, perhaps they can't talk, perhaps they have severe emotional issues. They might have suicidal ideation. And when you get to that level where you need that kind of extra care, you couldn't have them in a regular classroom. So that would be the least restrictive environment. And then the final one is being educated in a hospital. So in education, we need to get this balance between what is the most helpful for their education and what is the most helpful for their education. So we need to get them into what is the most inclusive in the least restrictive environment. And that is a concept that we're going to talk about, because for some students, it is not appropriate for them to be in a separate school. There are some students who have disabilities who could survive in a separate classroom in a mainstream school. There are some students in a mainstream school who could survive if they just have specific lessons in a resource room. So when we do inclusion, that is something else that we need to think about. And finally, the philosophy of inclusion, if we go back to our 4 models, inclusion is about trying to move away from segregation as much as possible, trying to move away from integration as much as possible, and certainly trying to get rid of exclusion altogether. But when we're doing inclusion, there is a big difference between equality, justice, and inclusion. Inclusion is about getting the students in the best classroom possible, so the best in the least restrictive environment, in the environment where they are going to be able to thrive, with taking away their barriers and taking away the things that stop them from learning. So if we were doing equality, which is perhaps integration, that's where we're treating all students the same and there's no adjustments. And when you have equality, there are some students that will miss out. Now, when you do justice, this is more like segregation. You're giving them a step up by giving them a particular setting that helps them achieve. But what's even better than segregation and what is even better than integration is inclusion, where you take away the barriers and change the way you operate so that everyone can learn on the same level. So inclusion is very much about changing the way we teach so that everyone can learn. So I hope that this mini lecture has been helpful. I've got some readings below that I would like you to read. I'd like you to learn about a few things in particular about ableism, about the least restrictive environment, and about some of the different philosophies for inclusion. And I've left some notes on what I want you to read. And I hope that it's very helpful in helping you understand what inclusive education is all about.